I stopped a kidnapping because I couldn't hold my bladder during a pizza delivery. I was having one of those nights at work where you don't get a single second to breathe. Back-to-back deliveries, no breaks, not even enough time to use a bathroom. I had been holding it for about 2 hours when the urge suddenly hit me like a truck. I was mid-drive to my next delivery when my body decided it was done waiting. Thankfully, I was only a few minutes from the customer's house, so I figured I could drop off the pizza and find a gas station on the way back. When I pulled up to the address, something felt off. The house was completely dark. No lights, no TV glow, nothing. The streetlight closest to the house was broken, so the whole front yard was pitch black. It was a college neighborhood, and since it was summer, most students were gone. The block was dead silent. I sat in my car trying to figure out if I had the right place. Someone ordered this pizza, but it didn't look like anyone was home. I called the number on the order and a voice picked up sounding out of breath. She just said yeah, like she was distracted. I told her I was outside with her pizza, but nobody seemed to be home. She said she wasn't home yet, that she lost track of time at work and was running back right now. I was irritated because I really had to go, so I told her we might have to cancel since she was supposed to pay cash and wasn't there. She immediately got apologetic and panicked. She said she was so sorry that she was literally sprinting home and begged me to wait 5 minutes. Her voice sounded young, maybe early 20s, and genuinely stressed. I felt bad for being short with her, so I told her it was fine and I would wait. After I hung up, I sat in my car trying to figure out what to do about my situation. I looked around, but every house on the street was close together with no privacy anywhere. No gas stations nearby, nothing. I had thrown away my empty water bottle at the last delivery like an idiot. The pressure was becoming unbearable. I looked at the customer's house again. She wasn't home. The streetlight was out. Nobody could see me. I made a decision I'm not proud of. I got out of my car and walked toward the bushes lining the front of her house. There was a thick cluster right next to her front door, tall enough to give me cover. I looked around one more time, unzipped, and started going. The relief was immediate, but something was wrong. The sound wasn't right. It wasn't hitting leaves. It sounded like I was hitting something solid, like fabric. Before I could figure out what was happening, I heard a deep voice from directly in front of me say, "What the FCK?" A man exploded out of the bushes. He shoved past me, wiping his face and spitting as he ran. I had gotten him directly in the face. I stood there frozen, not processing what happened. The man sprinted down the street and I heard a car door slam and tires screech seconds later. My brain was trying to make sense of it. Why was a man hiding in bushes in front of a young woman's house at night? Why was he wearing a hoodie in 90-degree heat? I knew the answer but didn't want to accept it. I should have called the police right then. Instead, my stupid brain convinced me there had to be a reasonable explanation. Maybe the bushes connected to a backyard. Maybe he was a boyfriend waiting to surprise her. I walked over to where he had been hiding and turned on my phone flashlight. The bushes were pressed right against the house. No backyard access, no window, no reason for anyone to be there. Then I saw it. A black duffel bag tucked behind the bushes against the foundation. It was partially unzipped. I crouched down and opened it more, shining my light inside. There was a roll of duct tape, a box cutter, zip ties, a bottle of something I didn't recognize, and underneath all of it, printed on paper, was a photo. A girl. Young, maybe 21, brown hair, big smile. The photo looked like it was taken from a distance, like she didn't know someone was watching. My stomach dropped. I stumbled backward and pulled out my phone to call police. As I was dialing, I heard footsteps on the sidewalk. I looked up and saw her, the customer, the girl from the photo. She was walking toward me with keys in her hand, completely unaware. She smiled and waved, calling out that she was sorry for making me wait. I opened my mouth to warn her, to tell her to stay back, to explain what I found. But before I could speak, my phone started ringing. It was the same number I had called earlier, the customer's number, but the girl walking toward me wasn't holding a phone. She looked confused and asked if everything was okay. I looked at my phone, then back at her, and realized the man in the bushes had been the one who placed the order. I grabbed her arm hard and yanked her backward. She made a surprised noise and stumbled, but I didn't let go. I pulled her away from the house and told her to run right now. My voice came out rough and scared, and she must have heard something in it because she stopped trying to pull away. She looked at me with wide eyes and asked what was wrong. I told her to just go, to get away from here right now. She backed up a few steps down the sidewalk but didn't run. She kept staring at me like I was crazy. I glanced at the bushes where the duffel bag was still sitting, and then back at the street where the man had disappeared. My hands were shaking, so bad I could barely hold my phone. I pulled it out and dialed the police with fingers that didn't want to work right. The dispatcher answered and asked what my emergency was. I tried to explain, but the words came out jumbled and wrong. I told her there was a man hiding in bushes and he ran away, and there's a bag with duct tape and zip ties. She asked me to slow down and tell her what happened. I took a breath and tried again. I said I was making a pizza delivery, and I had to pee, so I went in the bushes, and there was a man hiding there. The dispatcher's voice changed, and she asked if I was calling to report public urination. I said no and tried to explain about the duffel bag. She interrupted and asked if I had been drinking. I felt panic rising because she wasn't listening. I said I wasn't drunk, there was a real emergency, the man had kidnapping supplies in a bag. I described the duct tape and box cutter and zip ties and the photo of the girl. The dispatcher's tone shifted completely. She asked if the man was still unseen. I said no. He ran when I accidentally peed on him. There was a pause, and then she asked me to repeat that. I explained the whole thing as fast as I could while watching the street. She told me to stay where I was and keep away from the bag. She said units were on the way. The girl was still standing on the sidewalk about 20 feet away. She looked confused and scared and kept glancing between me and her house. I wanted to explain but didn't know where to start. The dispatcher stayed on the line with me and asked for descriptions. I told her everything I could remember about the man, but it had happened so fast. Dark hoodie, average height, maybe white or Hispanic, I couldn't tell in the dark. She asked about his vehicle, and I said I heard a car door and tires but didn't see it. She asked about the girl, and I looked over at her. I said the intended victim was here. She was the one who ordered the pizza. The dispatcher told me to keep her away from the house and the bag. Police lights appeared at the end of the street, and I felt some of the panic ease up. 2 patrol cars came fast with lights flashing but no sirens. They pulled up and 4 officers got out. One came straight to me while the others spread out. The officer asked if I was the one who called. I said yes, and pointed at the bushes where the bag was. Another officer went over to the girl and started talking to her. She was shaking her head and pointing at me. The officer with me asked me to explain what happened. I went through the whole story again and felt my face burning when I got to the peeing part. The officer didn't react, just kept taking notes. He asked if I touched anything in the bag. I said I opened it more to see inside but didn't take anything out. He nodded and spoke into his radio. Another officer came over with evidence gloves and headed for the bushes. The officer separated me and the girl to different patrol cars. I sat in the back of one with the door open while he asked more questions. I could see the girl in the other car about 30 feet away. She kept looking over at me and her face was pale under the streetlight. The officer asked me to describe the contents of the bag again in detail. I listed everything I could remember. He asked about the photo, and I told him it was a printed picture of a girl with brown hair, maybe 21 years old. He asked if the girl matched the one sitting in the other patrol car. I looked over and said yes, it was definitely her. The officer's expression got more serious. He asked if I knew her or had any prior contact with her. I said no, this was the first time I ever came to this address. He asked about the phone call I got while she was walking up. I explained that the number was the same one I called earlier, but she wasn't holding a phone. The officer wrote everything down and then told me to wait there. I watched the other officer talking to the girl. He was showing her something on his phone, probably photos of the bag contents. Her face went completely white and she put her hand over her mouth. She looked like she might throw up. The officer kept talking to her, but she wasn't responding. Then she just sat down hard on the curb with her head between her knees. The officer crouched next to her, and I could see him talking, but couldn't hear what he said. Another officer brought over a water bottle. The girl took it but didn't drink, just held it in both hands. She looked up at the officer and I could see her mouth moving. She was asking questions. The officer showed her his phone again and pointed at the bushes. She turned to look, and then covered her face with her hands. Her shoulders started shaking and I realized she was crying. An unmarked car pulled up about 20 minutes after the patrol cars arrived. A woman got out wearing jeans and a blazer with a badge clipped to her belt. She looked to be in her 40s with dark hair pulled back and sharp eyes that took in the whole scene immediately. She talked to the officers for a minute and then walked over to examine the bushes and the bag. She spent a long time there, crouching down with a flashlight and looking at everything from different angles. She took photos with her phone and made notes. Then she went over to talk to the girl. I watched them through the window of my patrol car. The woman sat down on the curb next to the girl and talked to her for several minutes. The girl was still crying and wiping her eyes. The woman put a hand on her shoulder and kept talking in what looked like a calm voice. After a while, the woman stood up and came over to my patrol car. She introduced herself as Detective Valentina Bowers and said she needed to ask me some questions. I got out of the car and we stood near the trunk. She pulled out a notebook and asked me to start from the beginning. I went through the whole story again for what felt like the 10th time. She listened without interrupting and took detailed notes. When I got to the part about peeing on the man, she didn't crack a smile or make any comment. She just asked how long I had been going before I realized something was wrong. I estimated maybe 3 or 4 seconds. She asked about the sound difference I noticed. I explained that it sounded like fabric instead of leaves. She nodded and wrote that down. She asked what the man said when he came out of the bushes. I repeated the words as close as I could remember. She asked about his voice. Was it deep or high? Any accent? Any other details? I said it was a normal voice, maybe a little deep. No accent, I could tell. She asked about his clothing, and I described the hoodie again. She wanted to know if I saw any logos or text on it. I said no, it was too dark, and everything happened too fast. Valentina asked me about finding the bag, and I described opening it and seeing the contents. She wanted to know the exact order I saw things in. I said the duct tape was on top, then the box cutter, then the zip ties, and the bottle was underneath with the photo at the very bottom. She asked if I recognized the bottle or could read any label on it. I said no, I only saw it for a second before I saw the photo. She asked detailed questions about the photo itself. Was it color or black and white? What size was it? What was the girl wearing? Where did it look like it was taken? I answered everything I could remember. She asked if the photo looked recent or old. I said it looked recent, the paper was clean and not faded. She asked if there was any writing on it or any other photos. I said no, just the one photo. She asked about the bag itself, and I described it as a black duffel bag, maybe 2 feet long, with one main compartment that I could see. She asked if I moved the bag or just looked inside. I said I just opened it more and shined my light in. I didn't move it or take anything out. Valentina asked about the phone call I received. I explained the whole sequence of calling the customer, her saying she was on her way, then hanging up and seeing the girl approach, then getting a call from the same number. She asked if I answered the call. I said no, I was too shocked, and then the girl was asking if I was okay. Valentina asked what the girl said exactly. I repeated the conversation as close as I could remember. She asked if the girl seemed to know anything was wrong. I said no, she looked completely normal and confused about why I was acting weird. Valentina nodded and made more notes. She asked if I had any prior knowledge of anyone following or watching the girl. I said no, I had never met her before tonight. She asked if I had ever delivered to this address before. I said no, this was my first time. She asked how long I had worked as a delivery driver. I told her about 6 months. She asked if I had ever had any problems or weird incidents on deliveries before. I said no, nothing like this. Forensics arrived with a van full of equipment. They set up bright lights around the bushes and started taking photos and measurements. Valentina went over to supervise, and I stayed by the patrol car. One of the officers brought me a bottle of water and told me it might be a while longer. I drank it and watched the forensics team work. They were very careful and methodical, taking pictures of everything from multiple angles. One of them was examining the ground behind the bushes with a flashlight. Another was carefully removing items from the duffel bag and placing them in evidence bags. I saw them pull out the duct tape and the box cutter and the zip ties. They found the photo and put it in a clear evidence bag. One of the techs called Valentina over and showed her something. She crouched down and looked at where he was pointing. They talked for a minute, and then he started taking more photos. Another tech was collecting what looked like cigarette butts from the dirt. Valentina came back over and told me they found footprints behind the bushes and some cigarette butts that might have DNA. She said they also found a phone that the suspect dropped when he ran. She asked if I had seen him drop anything. I said no. Everything happened too fast, and I was too shocked to notice details like that. A second detective arrived, and Valentina introduced her as her partner, Francine. They talked quietly for a minute, and then Francine went over to the girl. She helped her up from the curb and walked her toward an unmarked car. I heard Francine explaining something about going to the hospital. The girl started shaking her head and saying nothing happened to her. Francine kept talking in a calm voice and said it was standard procedure and would help with documentation. The girl looked over at me and then back at Francine. She nodded and got in the car. Francine drove off with her, and the street got quieter. Valentina came back and said I could leave soon. She gave me her card and said I would need to come to the station tomorrow to give a formal statement. She asked if I understood the importance of not discussing the case with anyone. I said yes. She thanked me for calling it in and said I likely saved that girl's life tonight. I didn't know what to say to that. It felt too big and too strange. She went back to supervising the forensics team, and I stood there feeling numb. The officers finally told me I could go at 2 in the morning. My pizza delivery shift had ended 4 hours ago, and I still had the girl's pizza in my car, cold and forgotten. I drove home in a daze and sat in my car outside my apartment for 20 minutes before I could make myself go inside. My hands kept shaking when I tried to grip the steering wheel. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the contents of that duffel bag spread out under my phone light. The duct tape, the zip ties, the box cutter. That photo of Amy taken without her knowing. I kept thinking about what would have happened if I had just held it a few more minutes. If I had found a gas station instead. If I hadn't been so desperate that I walked over to those bushes. She would have come home alone to that dark house, and he would have been waiting. I felt sick thinking about it. The adrenaline that had kept me going through the police interviews was completely gone now, and I just felt hollow and shaky. I finally went inside and tried to sleep, but gave up after an hour of staring at the ceiling. My phone rang at 7 in the morning, and I grabbed it, hoping it was Valentina with news about catching the guy. Instead, it was Tegan, and she sounded furious. She asked where I was and why I never brought the delivery car back last night. I tried to explain that the police had kept me until 2 in the morning because I found evidence of a kidnapping attempt. She cut me off mid-sentence and told me she didn't want to hear excuses. She said I needed to come into the shop immediately to explain myself, and hung up before I could say anything else. I got dressed and drove to the pizza shop, dreading the conversation. I had worked there for 6 months, and Tegan had always been decent to me, but she ran a tight ship and didn't tolerate people not following protocol. When I walked into the shop, Tegan was behind the counter with her arms crossed, looking ready to tear into me. I opened my mouth to apologize, but she held up her hand and pointed at the TV mounted on the wall. The local news was on, and they were showing footage of Amy's street with police tape and evidence markers. The reporter was talking about an attempted kidnapping that was stopped by an alert pizza delivery driver who discovered suspicious items at the scene. Tegan's face went pale as she listened to the report. They showed a photo of the duffel bag contents that forensics had taken, and the reporter mentioned that the suspect was still at large. Tegan turned to me and asked if that was my last delivery address. I nodded, and she immediately apologized for yelling at me on the phone. She said I should have told her it was serious, but I pointed out that I tried to. She told me to take the day off and looked genuinely shaken. I could see her hands trembling as she poured herself coffee. I went home and tried to sleep again, but couldn't stop thinking about everything. Valentina called me around noon and asked if I could come to the station that afternoon to go over my statement again. She said they had recovered the attacker's phone from the scene and needed me to look at some photos. I drove to the police station and spent the next 3 hours in an interview room with Valentina, going through everything one more time. She had printed out dozens of photos from the attacker's phone and spread them across the table. Every single one was of Amy. Pictures of her leaving her house, pictures of her at the gym, pictures of her grocery shopping, pictures of her walking to her car. None of them looked like she knew someone was watching. Valentina asked if I recognized any of the locations, and I pointed out the gym that was 2 blocks from where I made the delivery. Some of the photos had dates in the corner going back almost 2 months. This guy had been following her for weeks. Valentina told me they got a positive ID on the attacker from fingerprints on the duffel bag. She said his name but asked me not to repeat it to anyone. She explained he was a registered sex offender who had moved to the area 6 months ago. He was supposed to register his new address with the state, but never did, which was a parole violation. They had his previous mugshot and criminal history, which included assault and attempted kidnapping from 8 years ago. He had served 5 years and been on parole ever since. Valentina showed me his photo, and I recognized him immediately as the man who had run out of the bushes. Even in the mugshot, his eyes looked cold and empty. She said they were working with his parole officer to track down any known associates or places he might go. The police issued a warrant for his arrest, but Valentina called me that evening to say he had completely disappeared. They checked his last known address, which was a room he rented in a house on the other side of town, but the landlord said he hadn't been there in 3 days. His car was found abandoned in a parking lot near the bus station. Valentina warned me to be careful because he knew I could identify him and might see me as a threat. She said it was unlikely he would come after me since that would draw more attention, but I should stay aware of my surroundings. She told me to call her immediately if I saw anything suspicious or if he tried to contact me. After we hung up, I checked all my door locks twice and made sure my windows were closed even though it was hot. That night, I couldn't sleep at all. Every sound outside made me jump. A car door slamming, someone walking past my building, the wind rattling my window. I kept getting up to check the locks and look out the peephole. Around 3 in the morning, I realized I was more scared now than I had been during the actual incident. When it was happening, everything moved so fast I didn't have time to process it. Now I had hours to think about the fact that a violent predator knew my face and might blame me for ruining his plans. I thought about him hiding in those bushes waiting for Amy. I thought about what he had planned to do with that duct tape and those zip ties. I thought about how he was out there somewhere right now, probably planning his next move. My phone rang the next afternoon, and the caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. It was Amy. Her voice sounded small and shaky. She said Valentina had given her my number from the police report, and she hoped it was okay that she called. She wanted to meet for coffee to thank me properly for what I did. I told her she didn't need to thank me, but she insisted. She said she needed to talk to someone who understood what happened. We agreed to meet at a busy coffee shop downtown in an hour. When I got to the coffee shop, Amy was already sitting at a corner table. She looked exhausted with dark circles under her eyes, like she hadn't slept any better than I had. She stood up when she saw me and gave me an awkward hug. We sat down and she immediately started thanking me for saving her life. She said if I hadn't been there, she doesn't know what would have happened. Then she started crying right there in the middle of the coffee shop. She kept saying she couldn't stop thinking about what almost happened. She said she kept imagining walking up to her dark house and him grabbing her from behind. She said Valentina showed her all the photos from his phone, and knowing he had been watching her for weeks made her feel violated and scared. Other people in the coffee shop were staring at us, but she didn't seem to notice. I sat there not knowing what to say because the whole situation felt surreal. She was thanking me for saving her life, but the only reason I found him was because I couldn't hold my bladder and decided to pee in her bushes. I finally admitted this out loud because it felt weird accepting gratitude for something so ridiculous. Amy stopped crying and looked at me for a second. Then she started laughing through her tears. She said it was the most ridiculous hero story she had ever heard. She said most people get saved by someone brave who runs into danger on purpose, but she got saved by someone who really had to pee. We both started laughing, and some of the tension broke. She wiped her eyes and said at least it was a story she could tell at parties someday, even if it was embarrassing. I told her I hoped she never told anyone the peeing part, but she just smiled and said that was the best part of the whole story. We didn't stay at the coffee shop much longer after that. Amy said she needed to get home and try to sleep even though she doubted she would. I walked her to her car and made sure she got in safely before heading to my own. The whole drive back to my apartment, I kept checking my mirrors to see if anyone was following me. Every set of headlights made my hands tighten on the steering wheel. I parked in my usual spot and sat there for a minute looking around the parking lot before getting out. The walk from my car to my building felt longer than usual. Every shadow seemed like it could be hiding someone. I got inside and locked my door behind me, then checked it 3 times to make sure it was actually locked. My phone rang 2 days later while I was at work. The caller ID showed the police department number. I stepped outside to take the call and it was Valentina. Her voice sounded different from before, lighter somehow. She told me they caught him. The attacker was trying to leave town on a Greyhound bus heading to Nevada when transit police pulled him off for a routine ID check. He had a fake driver's license with a different name and was carrying a backpack with $5,000 in cash. Valentina said they found bus schedules to 3 different cities in his pocket, and he was probably planning to disappear and start over somewhere new. She said somewhere new meant finding a new victim. I felt my legs go weak and had to sit down on the curb outside the pizza shop. She kept talking and told me he was in custody now and wouldn't be getting out. The fake ID alone was enough to hold him, but combined with everything else, he was looking at serious charges. I thanked her and hung up. My hands were shaking, so badly I dropped my phone twice trying to put it back in my pocket. I went back inside and tried to focus on work, but kept messing up orders. Tegan finally told me to go home early and get some rest. A week later, I got a call from someone named Russell Zimmerman, who introduced himself as the district attorney handling the case. He wanted to meet with both me and Amy to discuss what was going to happen next. We met at his office downtown in a building that smelled like old coffee and paper. Russell was in his 50s with gray hair and tired eyes that looked like they'd seen too much. He shook both our hands and led us into a small conference room with a table and 4 chairs. He sat down across from us and opened a thick folder. He explained that the attacker was charged with attempted kidnapping, stalking, and parole violation. The parole violation alone could send him back to prison for years, but Russell wanted to make sure he got the maximum sentence possible. He said the evidence was strong, and he was confident about getting a conviction. Amy asked how long the attacker might go to prison for, and Russell said if convicted on all charges, he could get 25 years. Her face went pale and she grabbed my hand under the table. Russell kept talking and told us the trial probably wouldn't happen for several months because these things take time. He said we would both need to testify and describe everything that happened that night. I felt my stomach turn thinking about standing in a courtroom and admitting I peed on someone. Russell opened his folder and pulled out several printed pages. He said the attacker's phone contained evidence of planning that went back over a month. The police forensics team had recovered deleted photos and search history that showed he had been researching Amy's schedule and routine. He knew what time she left for work and what time she came home. He knew which route she walked and where the streetlights were broken. Russell said the phone showed the attacker had driven by Amy's house at least 15 times in the past 3 weeks. He had taken photos of her house from different angles and had screenshots of the property layout from online real estate sites. But the worst part was that he had practiced hiding in those specific bushes multiple times. A neighbor 2 houses down had security camera footage showing a man matching the attacker's description, crouching in Amy's bushes on 3 separate nights when Amy wasn't home. He was timing how long it took to get from the bushes to the front door. He was planning the whole thing like it was some kind of project. Amy started crying when Russell told us this. She kept saying she couldn't believe someone had been watching her for that long without her knowing. Russell pushed a box of tissues across the table and waited for her to compose herself. He said the level of planning showed this wasn't an impulsive act. The attacker had been completely focused on making this happen, and that made him extremely dangerous. The next few weeks were rough for Amy. She called me one night around midnight, and I could barely understand her through her crying. She said she'd had another panic attack and couldn't breathe and didn't know what to do. I stayed on the phone with her for over an hour until she calmed down. She told me she couldn't stay in her apartment anymore because every sound made her think someone was breaking in. She couldn't sleep and barely ate and kept having flashbacks to that night, even though nothing had actually happened to her. 2 days later, she called again and said she was moving back in with her parents, who lived 2 hours away. She was dropping out of her summer classes and leaving town as soon as possible. I told her I understood, and that she needed to do what was best for her. She said she felt like she was giving up and letting him win, but I told her taking care of herself wasn't giving up. We met for coffee one more time before she left. She looked exhausted and had lost weight. She hugged me goodbye and made me promise to stay in touch. I watched her drive away and felt guilty that I got to stay in my normal life while hers was completely destroyed. 3 weeks after Amy left town, I got a notice in the mail about the preliminary hearing. I had to appear in court to testify about what happened that night. The hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning at 9. I took the day off work and put on the only dress shirt I owned that didn't have pizza sauce stains on it. The courthouse was downtown in an old building with marble floors and high ceilings that made every sound echo. I found the right courtroom and sat in the hallway outside waiting to be called. Amy showed up 10 minutes later looking nervous. She'd driven back from her parents' house just for this. We sat together not talking much because there wasn't much to say. A bailiff finally called my name and I walked into the courtroom. It was smaller than I expected, with wooden benches and fluorescent lights that buzzed. The judge sat at the front behind a tall desk. The prosecutor's table was on the left and the defense table was on the right. And sitting at the defense table next to his lawyer was the attacker. He looked different from I remembered. Cleaner, calmer, like a normal person instead of someone who had been hiding in bushes planning violence. I walked to the witness stand and a clerk made me swear to tell the truth. Then Russell stood up and started asking me questions. I had to describe the whole night from the beginning. The pizza delivery, the phone call, my need to use the bathroom, everything. The courtroom was completely silent while I talked. I could feel everyone staring at me. When I got to the part about peeing in the bushes, some people in the gallery shifted in their seats, but nobody laughed. Russell asked me to describe finding the duffel bag, and I went through all the items I saw inside. Then he asked me about seeing Amy walk up and realizing she was walking into a trap. My voice cracked a little when I answered that question. The whole time I was testifying, the attacker just stared at me. His eyes were cold and empty, like he was looking through me instead of at me. It made my skin crawl, and I had to force myself not to look away. When Russell finished his questions, the defense attorney stood up. He was younger than Russell and wore an expensive suit. He asked me if I had been drinking that night. I said no. He asked if I was sure I saw everything I claimed to see in the dark. I said yes. He asked if it was possible I misunderstood the situation. I said no. He kept asking variations of the same questions, trying to make me doubt myself, but I didn't budge. Finally, the judge told him to move on, and he sat back down. I was dismissed and walked out of the courtroom on shaky legs. Amy went in next, and I waited in the hallway for her. She came out 20 minutes later looking drained. We left the courthouse together, and she drove back to her parents' house that same day. When I got back to work the next day, my coworker Dustin was waiting for me. He had this huge grin on his face and kept slapping me on the back, saying I was a hero. He'd read about the preliminary hearing in the local news online and thought it was the coolest thing ever. Every time a customer came in, he would point at me and tell them I was the guy who stopped a kidnapping. I asked him to stop, but he just laughed and said I was being too modest. He didn't understand that I hated the attention and didn't want to be known for this. By the end of my shift, 3 different customers had asked me about it, and I wanted to disappear. Dustin meant well, but he was making everything worse. I finally pulled him aside and told him seriously to stop telling people. He looked confused and asked why I wasn't proud of what I did. I told him it wasn't about being proud, it was about not wanting to relive the most embarrassing and traumatic night of my life every time I came to work. He got quiet after that and apologized. He said he didn't realize it bothered me so much. I told him it was fine, but to please just let it drop. He agreed, and things got better after that. Valentina called me again a few days later. She said they had searched the attacker's apartment and found a key to a storage unit across town. When they opened the storage unit, they found things that made the duffel bag look tame. There were restraints bolted to the walls, bottles of sedatives that he must have stolen from somewhere. A soundproofed box made of thick wood that was big enough to fit a person inside. Valentina's voice was tight when she described it to me. She said the level of planning was unlike anything she'd seen in her 15 years as a detective. He had been preparing for this for months, maybe longer. He had a whole system worked out. The storage unit was rented under a fake name and paid for in cash, so it couldn't be traced back to him. She said they were still processing everything they found, but it was clear he had done this before or was planning to do it multiple times. I felt sick listening to her describe it all. I thought about Amy walking up to her house that night with no idea what was waiting for her. I thought about what would have happened if I hadn't needed to pee. The thought made me want to throw up. Valentina said she was telling me this because I deserved to know the full scope of what I had stopped. She said I saved Amy's life and probably saved other lives too. I thanked her and hung up. Then I went to the bathroom and threw up anyway. A woman named Jolene called me 2 days later. She introduced herself as Amy's victim advocate and said she was reaching out to see if I wanted counseling services. I told her I was fine and didn't need counseling because I wasn't the victim. Jolene said that witnesses can be traumatized too, especially when they're as involved as I was. She said seeing what I saw and knowing what almost happened can affect people in ways they don't expect. I insisted I was okay, but she gave me her number anyway and told me to call if I changed my mind. I put her number in my phone and forgot about it. But that night I had a nightmare. I was back on that dark street making the delivery. Everything happened the same way, except when I found the duffel bag, it was empty. I looked up and Amy was already at her front door unlocking it. I tried to yell to warn her, but no sound came out. The attacker came out of the bushes behind her and grabbed her. She looked right at me while he dragged her into the darkness and I couldn't move or speak or do anything. I woke up sweating and breathing hard. My sheets were soaked and my heart was pounding. I checked my phone and it was 3 a.m. I got up and checked all my locks even though I knew they were locked. Then I sat on my couch in the dark until the sun came up. The nightmares kept happening. Sometimes I found the bag in time and sometimes I didn't. Sometimes Amy disappeared and sometimes I disappeared. Sometimes the attacker came after me instead. I would wake up multiple times a night covered in sweat and feeling guilty, even though nothing bad actually happened. The guilt was the worst part. I kept thinking about how close it had been and how easily it could have gone wrong. What if I hadn't needed to pee? What if I had gone to a gas station instead? What if I had been 2 minutes later? Amy would be gone and it would be my fault for not being there. I knew logically that made no sense, but the guilt didn't care about logic. The pizza shop started getting media attention after the preliminary hearing. Local news stations ran stories about the attempted kidnapping and mentioned that a pizza delivery driver had discovered it. They didn't use my name, but people figured it out anyway. Tegan was thrilled about the publicity. She put up a sign in the window that said, "Home of the Hero Driver," and started offering a discount to anyone who mentioned the news story. She kept asking me to do interviews with the local news, but I refused every time. I told her I didn't want to be known as the guy who peed on a kidnapper, and she laughed like I was joking. She didn't understand that I was completely serious. The whole thing was humiliating, and I just wanted it to go away. But the attention kept coming. People would recognize me at the grocery store or gas station and want to talk about it. They all said the same things about how brave I was and how lucky Amy was. I would smile and thank them, and then leave as quickly as possible. I wasn't brave. I was just a guy who couldn't hold his bladder. The fact that it saved someone's life didn't make it any less embarrassing. 2 weeks later, Russell called me. I picked up the phone and he got straight to it without any small talk. The attacker's lawyer was pushing for a plea deal. They wanted to plead guilty to lesser charges in exchange for a shorter sentence. Russell explained that this was common, but he wanted me to know before he talked to Amy. I asked what that meant exactly, and he said probably around 8 to 10 years instead of the 15 to 20 we were looking at if we went to trial. I felt sick. 8 years seemed like nothing for what that guy had planned. Russell must have heard something in my silence because he said we didn't have to accept it. He just wanted me prepared for what was coming. I thanked him and hung up. I sat there staring at my phone for a while, trying to process what I'd just heard. The idea of that guy getting out in less than a decade made my stomach turn. My phone rang again an hour later and it was Amy. She was crying before I even said hello. Russell had just called her about the plea deal and she was losing it. She kept saying he deserves maximum punishment for what he planned to do to her. Her voice was shaking with anger more than fear. She said she wanted to fight it and make sure he got every single year he deserved. I tried to calm her down, but she wasn't having it. She said she knew what was in that bag and what he wanted to do, and 8 years wasn't enough. Not even close. I told her I agreed with her completely. She cried harder and said she was scared of going to trial, but more scared of him getting out too soon. We stayed on the phone for almost an hour while she went through every emotion possible. By the end, she was exhausted but determined. She said she was going to tell Russell no deal. 3 days later, we met at Russell's office downtown. It was one of those old buildings with marble floors and wood paneling that made everything feel serious and official. Amy looked tired, like she hadn't been sleeping. We sat across from Russell at his big desk, and he had files spread out everywhere. He started by saying he understood how we felt about the plea deal. Then he explained the reality of trials in a way that made my chest tight. There was always a risk a jury might not convict. Maybe they wouldn't believe the evidence was strong enough. Maybe they would think the attacker deserved a second chance. Maybe one juror would hold out and we'd end up with a mistrial. The plea deal guaranteed the attacker went to prison, even if it was for less time. A trial was a gamble. Amy listened to all of this with her arms crossed and her jaw set. When Russell finished, she asked what he thought we should do. He said honestly he thought we had a strong case, but nothing was ever certain with juries. Amy looked at me and I didn't know what to say. Russell kept talking about conviction rates and reasonable doubt and all these legal terms that made my head spin. Amy finally said she needed time to think about it. Russell said that was fine and he'd hold off on responding to the defense for now. A week after that meeting, Valentina called with news. Her investigation had uncovered something big. The attacker had been watching 3 other women in the area. She'd found evidence on his computer of surveillance photos and notes about their schedules. Valentina had contacted all 3 women, and they were horrified to learn they'd been potential targets. One of them had noticed a car following her a few times, but thought she was being paranoid. Another recognized her photo from the attacker's files as being taken outside her workplace. The 3rd woman had filed a police report months ago about someone going through her trash, but nothing came of it. Valentina said this changed everything because it showed a pattern of predatory behavior. It wasn't just about Amy anymore. This guy was actively hunting multiple women. I asked if this helped our case, and Valentina said absolutely. It showed planning and intent and made it much harder for the defense to claim this was some kind of misunderstanding. 2 days later, one of the other women came forward with more information. Her name was Simone, and she called Valentina directly. Simone said she'd dated the attacker briefly 2 years ago. It only lasted a few weeks before she realized something was wrong with him. He became obsessed with knowing where she was all the time. He would show up places she didn't tell him about. He took photos of her without asking. When she broke up with him, he didn't stop. He followed her and took more photos and called her dozens of times a day. She finally got a restraining order and moved to a different part of town. She thought she'd gotten away from him. Finding out he was still in the area and targeting other women made her feel sick. Valentina asked if Simone would be willing to testify, and she said yes without hesitation. She wanted to help stop him. Valentina met with Simone in person to get her full statement. Simone told her things that made the case even darker. The attacker had once told her that his fantasy was to have complete control over someone. Not just during a relationship, but total control. Simone said the way he said it scared her so much she left his apartment immediately. That was when she decided to end things. After the breakup, he would send her messages describing what he wanted to do. The messages were vague enough that police said they weren't direct threats, but Simone knew what he meant. She'd been scared of him ever since. She'd moved twice to get away from him, once to a different neighborhood and then to a different apartment in the same area when she thought she saw him near her building. She was terrified he would find her again. When Valentina showed her the photos from his computer, Simone recognized locations near both her old apartments. He'd been tracking her movements even after the restraining order. Valentina promised her they were going to put him away for a long time. The new evidence from Simone and the other potential victims changed everything. Russell called me and Amy separately to tell us he'd made a decision. He was rejecting the plea deal. The case was too strong now, and the attacker's pattern was too clear. Russell said he was pushing for trial with maximum charges. He wanted attempted kidnapping, stalking, and every parole violation they could add. With Simone's testimony about his stated fantasies and the evidence of multiple targets, the jury would see this wasn't some random mistake. This was a predator who'd been planning and hunting for years. Amy called me after she talked to Russell, and she sounded relieved. She said knowing other women were willing to stand up with her made her feel less alone. She was still scared of trial but felt better about fighting. The stress of everything caught up with me hard. I started making mistakes at work that I'd never made before. I delivered pizzas to wrong addresses twice in one shift. I forgot to collect payment from a customer. I dropped a pizza getting it out of my car and had to go back to the shop for a replacement. Tegan pulled me aside after that and asked if I was okay. I told her I was fine, but she didn't believe me. She said I could take some time off if I needed it. I said no at first because I didn't want to seem weak. But 2 days later, I delivered to the wrong street entirely and didn't realize it until the customer called asking where I was. That's when I knew I couldn't keep going like this. I called Tegan and told her I needed a week off. She said of course and told me not to worry about anything. She said my job would be here when I got back. I could tell she was worried about me, but trying not to show it. During my week off, I finally went to see the therapist Jolene had recommended. I'd been avoiding it because I didn't think I needed help. I wasn't the victim. But after the nightmares and the mistakes at work, I knew something was wrong. The therapist's office was in a quiet building with comfortable chairs and soft lighting. She introduced herself and asked me to tell her what brought me in. I explained everything starting from that night. She listened without interrupting and took notes. When I finished, she said what I was experiencing had a name: secondary trauma. It happens to witnesses who see or learn about traumatic events even if they're not directly harmed. She said my guilt over the bizarre circumstances was normal but misplaced. I didn't cause what happened. I stopped it. The fact that it happened in an embarrassing way didn't make it less valid or heroic. She said my brain was trying to process something it wasn't prepared for, and the nightmares and anxiety were part of that process. We spent the rest of the session talking about coping strategies. She taught me breathing exercises and ways to redirect my thoughts when the guilt started spiraling. By the time I left, I felt lighter somehow, like someone had finally explained why I felt so messed up. Amy started going to a support group for stalking victims around the same time. She told me about it when we met for coffee during my week off. She said at first she didn't want to go because she felt like her situation was different. Nothing had actually happened to her. But her advocate Jolene convinced her to try one meeting. Amy said walking into that room full of people who understood was overwhelming. Everyone there had experienced being watched and followed and violated in similar ways. Some had it worse than her. Some had it better. But they all got it in a way no one else could. She said one woman told her that surviving isn't about being strong all the time. It's about accepting help when you need it. That stuck with Amy. She'd been trying so hard to be tough and not let this break her. But the support group taught her it was okay to fall apart sometimes. It was okay to be scared and angry and confused. She didn't have to have it all together. She started going every week and said it was helping her process everything that happened. She felt less alone knowing other people were fighting the same battles. A few days after the support group conversation with Amy, my phone rang while I was restocking sauce containers at the pizza shop. Valentina's name showed up on the screen, and I stepped into the back hallway to answer. She sounded tired when she spoke, like she'd been working too many hours without sleep. She told me they'd searched the attacker's storage unit and found things that made the case even worse than they thought. I asked what kind of things, and she paused for a long moment before answering. Journals, she said. Notebooks full of detailed plans written over months. He described exactly what he wanted to do to Amy once he got her to a remote location. The words came out flat and professional, but I could hear the disgust underneath. He wrote about keeping her for weeks and researching cabins in the mountains where nobody would hear anything. My stomach turned and I had to lean against the wall. Valentina said she wanted me to know because Russell would be sharing some excerpts with me soon as part of trial preparation. She warned me it would be difficult to read, but it was important I understood the full scope of what I'd actually stopped that night. Russell called 2 days later and asked me to come to his office downtown. The building was all glass and steel with a lobby that echoed when I walked across it. His office was on the 7th floor with a view of the courthouse across the street. He had folders spread across his desk, and his tie was loosened like he'd been there since early morning. He thanked me for coming, and then slid a thin folder across the desk toward me. These are copies of selected journal entries, he said. I need you to read them so you understand what we're dealing with. I opened the folder and started reading. The handwriting was neat and careful, almost elegant, which made the content even more disturbing. The attacker had written dates and times when he saw Amy at different locations. He described her routine in detail, what time she left for work, which route she took home, when her apartment lights went off at night. Then the entries shifted to planning. He wrote about buying supplies and testing different restraints. He described finding the perfect hiding spot in those bushes and practicing crouching there without being seen. The final entries were about his fantasy of what would happen after he grabbed her. The details made me feel physically sick, and I had to stop reading halfway through. Russell watched me carefully and asked if I was okay. I wasn't, but I nodded anyway. He said the jury would see portions of these journals, and they needed to understand I wasn't just some guy who stumbled into a situation. I'd stopped something that would have been unimaginable. I left his office feeling worse than when I'd arrived, and spent the rest of the day unable to focus on anything else. Russell called me and Amy separately a week later to tell us the trial date was set for 2 months away. When he called me back with Amy on the line too, his voice had that serious tone lawyers use when they're about to say something you won't like. He told us the defense attorney was going to try making the attacker seem less dangerous than he actually was. They'd attack our credibility and try to make the whole thing seem like a misunderstanding or an overreaction. Russell said they'd definitely bring up how I found the evidence and try to make me look unreliable. Amy asked what that meant, and Russell explained they'd focus on the embarrassing circumstances to make the jury question whether I was making things up or exaggerating. I felt my face get hot just thinking about having to explain the peeing incident again in front of more people. Russell said we needed to be prepared for hostile questions and not let them rattle us. The truth was on our side, but trials were unpredictable, and the defense would do everything possible to create doubt. I went back to work the next day, but pulled Tegan aside before my shift started. I asked if she could keep me off the delivery route that included Amy's old neighborhood. I didn't want to drive past that house again or deal with the memories it brought up. Tegan looked at me for a long moment, and then nodded without asking questions. She said she'd rearrange the routes and even offered to let me work kitchen shifts when I needed a break from deliveries. I thanked her and felt some of the tension leave my shoulders. Having that one thing under my control made everything else feel slightly more manageable. Dustin noticed the route changes and asked about it, but I just told him I needed a break from that area. He seemed to understand and didn't push for details. Amy called me 3 weeks before the trial was supposed to start. She sounded different, more resolved about something. She told me she'd made a decision to move to a different city entirely and start over somewhere the attacker had never known about. She'd already found an apartment and put in transfer paperwork at her job. I asked where she was going, but she said she didn't want to tell anyone the specific location yet. She just needed to be somewhere that didn't have memories of being hunted attached to every street corner. She said she couldn't heal in a place where she was constantly reminded of what almost happened. I understood, even though part of me felt sad that she was leaving. She promised she'd come back for the trial, but after that she was gone for good. Her voice sounded lighter when she talked about the move, like she was already imagining a life where she felt safe again. Things got weird with Dustin after he saw me have a panic attack in the pizza shop bathroom. It happened during a dinner rush when we were slammed with orders. I'd grabbed a stack of boxes from the storage closet and suddenly couldn't breathe. My chest got tight and my hands started shaking so bad I dropped the boxes. I made it to the bathroom and locked myself in a stall trying to get my breathing under control. Dustin came looking for me because I'd been gone too long and heard me gasping for air. He asked if I was okay through the door and I couldn't answer. When I finally came out 20 minutes later, he looked genuinely worried instead of his usual joking self. He stopped calling me a hero after that and actually apologized for not understanding how serious everything was for me. He said he'd been treating it like some cool story without thinking about how it actually affected me. I appreciated the apology, but it made me realize how much I'd been pretending to be fine when I wasn't. Valentina called again about 6 weeks after the journal discovery. She had news about the defense strategy, and none of it was good. The attacker's lawyer was trying a new approach through some legal motions. They were claiming he was just a peeping Tom who liked watching Amy, and the kidnapping supplies were for a completely different purpose. Valentina said it was obviously garbage, but the lawyer was trying to create reasonable doubt any way possible. She sounded frustrated when she explained it, and said the prosecution team was preparing counter-arguments. I asked if it would work, and she said probably not with all the evidence they had, but juries were unpredictable. The attacker was trying everything to avoid the maximum sentence, and his lawyer was doing their job even if it meant lying. Russell scheduled multiple preparation sessions with me as the trial date got closer. We met in a conference room at the courthouse, and he played defense attorney, asking me hostile questions to prepare me for cross-examination. He warned me the defense would definitely bring up the peeing incident to make me seem unreliable or like I was making the whole thing up for attention. We practiced how I should answer without getting defensive or embarrassed. Russell told me to stick to simple facts and not try to explain or justify anything. The truth was weird enough that adding explanations would just make it worse. He made me go through my testimony 5 times until I could tell the story without stumbling over the embarrassing parts. By the end, I felt slightly more confident, but still dreaded having to say it all in front of a courtroom full of strangers. Amy came back to town 3 days before the trial started and asked to meet for coffee. She looked different when I saw her walk into the cafe. Better somehow, more rested and less jumpy than the last time we'd met. She'd cut her hair shorter and wore different clothes than her usual style. She said her new city felt safer because nobody there knew what happened to her. She could walk down the street without wondering if someone was watching. She'd made new friends who only knew her as a regular person, not a victim. She talked about her job and her new apartment with actual enthusiasm instead of the flat tone she'd had before. I was happy for her, but also worried about the trial bringing everything back. She said she was ready, though, and had practiced her testimony with Russell just like I had. We spent 2 hours catching up, and when we left, she hugged me and said she was glad I'd be there during the trial. Having someone who understood made it less scary. The defense attorney filed a motion to suppress the duffel bag evidence 2 days before trial. Russell called me immediately to explain what was happening. They were claiming I'd contaminated the scene by looking inside the bag before police arrived. The motion argued that my actions made the evidence unreliable and it should be thrown out entirely. I felt panic rising because without that bag, the whole case fell apart. Russell told me not to worry and explained the judge would hear arguments the next morning. He was confident the motion would be denied because I'd called police right away and hadn't actually touched anything except to open the bag wider. The next day, I sat in the courtroom gallery while lawyers argued back and forth about chain of custody and proper procedure. The judge listened to both sides and then denied the motion without much hesitation. She said my immediate call to police and the responding officer's quick arrival meant the evidence was properly preserved. I felt relief wash over me as Russell turned and gave me a small nod from the prosecutor's table. Russell called me the next day to say Simone had agreed to testify. She was nervous about facing the attacker again, but she wanted to help make sure he stayed locked up. Russell explained her testimony would show this wasn't some one-time mistake or misunderstanding. The attacker had done this before with her, and probably with other women too. Simone was bringing copies of the restraining order she got against him 2 years ago, plus police reports from when he followed her and took pictures without her knowing. Russell sounded confident that her testimony would destroy any attempt by the defense to make the attacker seem like a normal guy who made one bad choice. I felt grateful she was willing to go through that because I knew it couldn't be easy for her. That night, I had another nightmare about Amy disappearing into that house while I stood frozen, unable to move or speak. I woke up gasping and sweating at 3 a.m. with my heart racing. But this time, instead of lying there panicking, I sat up and turned on the light. My therapist had taught me breathing exercises and grounding techniques for exactly this situation. I focused on slowing my breathing down and counting backwards from 100. I named 5 things I could see in my room, 4 things I could touch, 3 things I could hear. It took almost an hour, but eventually my heart rate came back down and the panic faded. I didn't fall back asleep, but I also didn't spiral into the kind of anxiety attack that used to leave me shaking for hours. It felt like progress, even though it was small. The morning the trial started, I put on the only dress shirt I owned and tried not to throw up from nerves. The courthouse was packed when I arrived. News vans lined the street and reporters stood on the steps doing live broadcasts. Russell had warned me there would be media attention because attempted kidnapping cases with this much evidence were rare enough to be newsworthy. I pushed through the crowd, keeping my head down, and found Amy waiting in a small room off the main hallway. She looked terrified. We sat together, not talking much because there wasn't anything useful to say. We both knew what was coming, and no amount of preparation made it less scary. Through the door, I could hear people filling the courtroom, voices echoing off the high ceilings. Russell came in to check on us and said the jury selection had gone well. He reminded us to just tell the truth and not worry about making the story sound better or worse than it was. When they called me to testify, I walked into that courtroom and saw every seat filled. The jury sat along the side wall watching me. The attacker sat at the defense table staring straight ahead. I took the oath and sat down in the witness box, and Russell started asking me questions. I told the whole story from the beginning, including the part about needing to pee. So badly I made a stupid decision. Some people in the gallery laughed nervously when I got to the part about accidentally peeing on the attacker's face. I felt my face get hot, but I kept going. Russell had me describe finding the duffel bag and what was inside it. He had me explain how I realized the attacker had placed the order to lure Amy home. The jury listened closely, and several of them took notes. When Russell finished the defense, attorney stood up for cross-examination. He tried to suggest I had contaminated evidence or maybe exaggerated what I saw in the bag. But Russell had prepared me for this, and I stuck to simple facts without getting defensive. The defense attorney seemed frustrated that he couldn't shake my story. After 40 minutes on the stand, the judge let me step down. I felt exhausted, but also relieved it was over. Amy testified next, and I watched from the gallery. She described her normal routine and how she never noticed anyone following her or taking pictures. When Russell showed her the photo from the duffel bag, she started crying. She explained it was taken outside her gym 3 weeks before that night, and she had no idea anyone was watching her. She talked about how violated she felt knowing someone had studied her habits and planned to hurt her. Her voice shook, but she kept going. Several jury members looked visibly upset, and one woman wiped her eyes. Amy described the moment she walked up to her house that night, completely unaware of what was waiting in those bushes. She said she still has nightmares about what would have happened if I hadn't been there. The defense attorney tried to object to that as speculation, but the judge allowed it. During cross-examination, the defense attorney asked Amy if she had ever spoken to the attacker before that night. She said no. He asked if she had ever smiled at him or given him any indication she was interested. Amy's face went red, and she said absolutely not. The defense attorney started to suggest that maybe she had been friendly without realizing it, and that the attacker misunderstood her intentions. Russell shot out of his chair, objecting before the attorney even finished the question. The judge sustained the objection immediately and told the defense attorney in a sharp voice that victim blaming would not be tolerated in her courtroom. She warned him that if he continued down that path, she would hold him in contempt. The defense attorney backed off, but the damage to his credibility with the jury was obvious. Several jury members were glaring at him. Simone testified on the 3rd day of trial. She walked to the stand looking nervous but determined. Russell asked her to describe her relationship with the attacker 2 years ago. She said they went on 3 dates before she realized something was wrong with him. He became obsessive immediately, texting her constantly and showing up at her apartment unannounced. When she told him she didn't want to see him anymore, he refused to accept it. He followed her to work and to the grocery store. He took pictures of her through her windows. She found notes on her car. Simone pulled out the restraining order documents and old police reports showing she had filed complaints about his behavior. She described how she had to move to a different apartment and change her phone number to get away from him. Russell asked if the attacker had ever expressed fantasies about control or ownership. Simone said yes, that during their last conversation, he told her he knew they were meant to be together, and eventually she would understand that she belonged to him. The jury looked horrified. The prosecution read excerpts from the attacker's journals on the fourth day. He had written pages about Amy describing her schedule down to the minute. He noted what time she left for work, when she went to the gym, what route she took home. He wrote about watching her through her windows and learning her habits. The journal entries described his plan to grab her when she came home late from work, to use the pizza delivery as bait to make sure she would be alone. He had researched remote cabins where he could take her and written about keeping her there for weeks. The detailed planning was undeniable. One journal entry described practicing hiding in those specific bushes multiple times to find the best position. Another entry talked about buying the supplies in different stores so no one would remember him. The jury looked sick as Russell read through page after page of calculated predatory behavior. The defense put the attacker on the stand on the fifth day. He wore a suit and kept his voice soft and apologetic. He claimed he had been going through a difficult time and made some bad choices, but never actually intended to hurt anyone. He said the supplies in the bag were for a different purpose that he couldn't explain. He tried to seem remorseful and confused about how things had gotten so out of control. But when Russell stood up for cross-examination, everything changed. Russell asked pointed questions about the journal entries, and the attacker started getting defensive. Russell asked why he had Amy's photo if he had never met her. The attacker said he couldn't remember where he got it. Russell asked about the detailed schedule tracking, and the attacker's voice got harder. He said lots of people notice patterns in their neighborhoods. Russell pressed him on why he ran when I discovered him, and the attacker snapped that anyone would run if someone peed on them. His mask slipped completely. The soft, apologetic tone disappeared, and his face showed cold anger. Russell kept pushing, and the attacker's answers became more hostile until even his own lawyer looked worried. The jury watched the transformation, and several of them leaned back in their seats like they were trying to get away from him. The jury got the case after closing arguments and deliberated for 4 hours. Amy and I sat in the hallway waiting, and neither of us could sit still. We walked up and down the corridor checking our phones every 2 minutes, even though we knew the court clerk would come get us when there was news. When the clerk finally appeared and said the jury had reached a verdict, we followed her back into the courtroom on shaking legs. The jury filed in looking serious. The judge asked if they had reached a verdict, and the foreman said yes. Guilty on all charges. Amy grabbed my hand so hard it hurt, and we both started crying. The attacker's face went blank and then twisted with rage. His lawyer put a hand on his arm to keep him seated. The judge thanked the jury and set a sentencing date for 2 weeks later. As they led the attacker out in handcuffs, he looked back at Amy and me with pure hatred in his eyes, but I didn't care anymore because he was going to prison and couldn't hurt anyone else. 2 weeks later, I sat in the courtroom waiting for sentencing, and my stomach felt like it was full of rocks. Amy was sitting next to me in the front row, and she kept smoothing down her dress with both hands. Russell stood at the prosecution table, looking through his notes one more time. The attacker sat at the defense table in his orange jumpsuit, and he stared straight ahead at the wall without moving. The judge came in and everyone stood up and then sat back down. She asked if anyone wanted to make a statement before sentencing, and Russell nodded toward Amy. Amy stood up and walked to the podium with a piece of paper in her hands. She looked directly at the attacker when she started reading, and her voice didn't shake at all. She talked about how finding out she'd been watched for weeks made her feel like her entire life had been violated. She said she couldn't sleep in her apartment anymore and had to move away from everything she knew. She described the panic attacks and nightmares and how she jumped every time someone walked behind her. She said the stalking took away her sense of safety in the world and made her question every stranger she passed. She talked about how close she came to being taken and what might have happened if I hadn't been there. Her voice stayed strong and clear the whole time, and she never looked away from the attacker's face. When she finished, she folded the paper and walked back to her seat without crying, even though I could see her hands shaking. The judge asked if anyone else wanted to speak, and Russell looked at me. I stood up and walked to the podium, feeling like everyone was staring at me. I pulled out the statement I'd written with my therapist and started reading. I talked about the nightmares where I was too late and Amy disappeared. I described how I couldn't do deliveries anymore without checking every shadow and feeling scared. I said I felt guilty about the weird way everything happened and how people treated me like a hero when I just needed to pee. I talked about the fear that came after when I realized the attacker knew who I was and where to find me. I said I hoped he never got the chance to hurt anyone else because his journals showed he was planning to do this again. I said Amy deserved to feel safe, and so did all the other women he'd been watching. My voice cracked a little at the end, but I got through it and sat back down. The judge looked at the attacker and asked if he wanted to say anything. His lawyer whispered to him, but he just shook his head no and kept staring at the wall. The judge opened a folder and started talking about the charges and the evidence and how serious the crimes were. She said the journals showed clear planning and intent to cause serious harm. She said the stalking had gone on for weeks, and the kidnapping supplies left no doubt about his intentions. She said his past conviction and parole violation showed he was a danger to the community. Then she said she was sentencing him to 25 years in prison with no possibility of parole for 15 years. Amy grabbed my hand and squeezed it hard. The attacker's face didn't change at all, but his lawyer leaned back in his chair looking defeated. Russell turned around and gave us a small nod. The judge asked if there was anything else, and when no one spoke, she banged her gavel. Guards came and took the attacker away through a side door, and he looked back at Amy and me one last time with empty eyes. Russell came over after and told us it was close to the maximum sentence possible. He said the judge clearly took the case seriously and wanted to make sure the attacker couldn't hurt anyone for a long time. He shook both our hands and said we did great with our statements. Amy thanked him for everything, and her voice was thick like she was about to cry, but she held it together. Outside the courthouse, Valentina was waiting by her car. She walked over and told us the attacker's journals had mentioned 3 other women by name as potential targets. She said we likely saved lives beyond just Amy's because his plans were getting worse and more detailed. She said if he'd succeeded with Amy, he probably would have gone after the others too. Amy started crying then, and Valentina put a hand on her shoulder. She said the police department was using this case to improve how they handle stalking reports and train officers to take them more seriously. She thanked me again for my testimony and said not many witnesses follow through when cases get difficult. Amy hugged me hard and whispered thank you in my ear. She said she was starting graduate school in her new city next month. She said she felt like she could finally move forward now that sentencing was done and he was locked away. She said she still had bad days, but they were getting less frequent. I told her I was glad she was doing okay and meant it. We exchanged numbers and promised to stay in touch, and then she got in her car and drove away. I went back to work full-time the next week and threw myself into deliveries. The nightmares started coming less often, and I could go whole nights without waking up in a panic. Tegan called me into her office one afternoon and said she was promoting me to shift supervisor. She said I'd handled everything with maturity, and she trusted me to manage other drivers. The promotion came with better pay, and I could control my schedule more, which meant I could avoid late-night deliveries when my anxiety got worse. I thanked her, and she said I earned it. 6 months later, I got an email from Valentina. She said the attacker had tried to appeal his sentence, claiming his trial wasn't fair, but the appeal was denied. She said he would serve the full 15 years minimum before even being considered for parole. She thanked me again for my testimony and said the case helped her department change their policies. She said they now take stalking reports more seriously and assign detectives sooner instead of waiting for something worse to happen. She said they were using the attacker's journals in training to show officers what escalating behavior looks like. I ran into Dustin at a bar a few weeks after that, and we sat in a booth talking for hours. He apologized again for treating the whole thing like it was just a funny story when it first happened. He said he didn't understand the impact until he saw me have that panic attack at work. I told him it was okay because I didn't understand it myself at first. I said I thought I would just move on, but trauma doesn't work that way. He bought me a beer and said he was glad I was doing better. We talked about work and normal stuff, and it felt good to have a conversation that wasn't about that night. Amy sent me a card on the 1-year anniversary. Inside, she'd written that she was thriving in her new city with a good job and a boyfriend who made her feel safe. She said she still thought about what almost happened sometimes, but it didn't control her life anymore. She said she was grateful every day that I needed to pee at exactly the right moment. She said she hoped I was healing too, and that we both deserved peace after everything. I put the card on my fridge where I could see it. I realized one morning that I didn't check my locks 3 times before bed anymore. I didn't jump when someone walked up behind me at the store. I could drive down dark streets without my heart racing. The hypervigilance had faded, so slowly I didn't notice until it was mostly gone. My therapist said I'd processed the trauma well and didn't need regular sessions anymore. She said I could call if I needed to, but I was doing the work and making real progress. I thanked her and meant it because she helped me understand that witnessing something terrible affects you, even when it doesn't happen to you directly. Tegan called me into her office on a Friday afternoon and told me to sit down. She handed me an envelope and said it was a bonus for the quarter. I opened it and saw a check for $2,000. She said I was her best supervisor because I understood that everyone has hard days and needs support. She said the other supervisors just barked orders and wrote people up, but I actually listened when drivers were struggling. I thanked her and she waved it off, saying I earned it by making the team stronger. I walked out of her office thinking about how this whole experience taught me something important. Strength isn't about being unaffected by bad things or pretending nothing bothers you. It's about asking for help when you need it and accepting that trauma changes you. I used to think getting over something meant going back to how you were before, but that's not how it works. You move forward as a different person who learned something hard. 2 years later, I'm managing my own pizza shop location across town and doing well. The owner promoted me after I turned my old store into the highest performing location in the region. I have my own office now, and a team of 15 people who I try to support the way Tegan supported me. I still think about that night sometimes when I'm doing paperwork or driving home late. I think about how a full bladder led to saving someone's life in the most ridiculous way possible. It's still embarrassing when people bring it up, and they do, because the story made local news and someone always remembers. But I've made peace with being the guy who peed on a kidnapper and stopped something terrible from happening. Amy sends me a Christmas card every year with updates about her life. She's married now with a good job and seems genuinely happy. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd found a gas station that night or held it 5 more minutes. Then I remind myself there's no point in wondering about things that didn't happen. What matters is what did happen, and somehow everything worked out.